So go ahead and open up InstaMAT and create a new package. Now, if you're very unfamiliar with InstaMAT, maybe this is like the first time you've even opened it up or ever seen it, I wouldn't recommend watching this video first. In fact, I do have a 2-hour walkthrough video where we go and create kind of like your first material in InstaMAT. So I'm going to link that to this video in the description or probably in the top right of this video right now. But if you're looking for something a little more advanced, we're not going to do as much hand holding as we maybe did in that video. Stick around because we're going to create some really cool rocks, and we're going to do it in a very interesting way. At least it's kind of new to me. So traditionally, how I've done it, and I'm sure a lot of material artists have done it, is that you go and create like a 2-dimensional rock shape using nodes, and then you use this like 2-dimensional image of a rock, basically a height map of a rock, to scatter around and create a bunch of these rock pattern like scattered designs. What we can do in InstaMAT is actually create these rocks in 3 dimension, like a 3D mesh, and then use this graph as like a rock mesh generator to actually drive the rock scattered piles and stuff. It's actually really, really cool. So I'm excited to show you here. So create a new graph, call it rock mesh, and this is going to be the graph that houses the generation of a 3D mesh. We're not actually even touching any 2D material stuff in this graph. Now, in order to get started, we want to go ahead and add our first node, which is going to be a mesh shape generator. Fortunately for me, it was still able to figure out what I wanted, even though I typed in completely the wrong words. It's not a good start. I'm already starting off on the first node. I'm spelling it wrong. Anyways, we want to use the mesh shape generator. And this is going to be exactly what the node says, just a generator of kind of like a base primitive shape. And you can tell that this is a mesh node by the vertice and polygon count, as well as the output socket here. It's brown, which we probably haven't seen a whole lot of if we've just been doing materials. So that's indicative that this is for mesh data. Now to see this, we have to go into our 3D view and open this up. And I'd actually like to put the 3D view kind of in our main window here. So I'm just gonna swap over there. So now we've got our 3D here and our node graph here. And I can actually bring this down as well. We don't need that. So in order to see the mesh in our 3D view, you can either double click on the node if you have the double click preview set up in your preferences, or you can just go and single click on the output socket. And that should change the mesh in your 3D view. So by default, it's going to give us this UV sphere. I want to go and crank up the segments of that. So I'll click on the little lock to make sure we're tackling both of these segments, X and the Y, and we'll crank it up to something like 30. So this is going to be the base kind of rock shape. And from here, we're going to iterate by kind of destroying it a little bit using some Boolean, mesh Boolean stuff. But before we can go ahead and start destroying it, we need to create that Boolean shape to actually start taking away from this rock here. So what I'll do is I'm going to use this base shape just briefly, kind of in a side chain. And what I'd like to do is the mesh, well, already starting to spell it wrong again, the mesh scatter on topology. So what this does is it just scatters another input mesh on the topology that we provided. So if I double click on this, you can see that by default, it's going to scatter a bunch of these like cubes. And it's maybe a little tough to see, but it's actually using the topology of this sphere. So if I increase the radius, you can see that it's placing these on the surface of our previous input mesh. Now I'm just going to leave that at default. And what I'd like to do, I'm going to Alt and click to drag out a new copy, plug that in. What I'd like to do is change this mesh shape generator from UV sphere over to plane. So I'm just going to hit F to zoom in here, you can see that we have these planes just kind of mapped around our cube, or sorry, our sphere. Basic shapes escape me sometimes. And let's go and crank up the width and the depth. We want this to be 10 for each so that they're kind of intersecting and they're creating these very faceted faces, which hopefully you can kind of get the idea what we're going for here is this is going to be the cutter for this original mesh. And these are going to be just the faces. So you can change the number of these as well. So if you want more, you can change the amount to something like 11, or if you think that's too much, you can go down to 3. It's kind of whatever you want. But we're going to have a difficult time using just this shape alone to try and cut in with our original shape. We need to do one more step before we can do that. I'm going to drag this out and I'm going to use a mesh voxelize node. And this is a really handy node. We're going to use it a couple times throughout this video. But basically what it does is it just creates like a remesh of the topology you provided. So if I just select this, add that to the seam, and I double click, you can see what it's done is it's taken those planes and just kind of remeshed it into one solid continuous shape here. So this is what we're going to need to actually Boolean properly. If you just use something like this that's kind of intersecting and doesn't really have like one continuous non-manifold mesh, it's going to pretty much fail on you, I think 10 times out of 10. I think you need to probably go ahead and do something like this where you can voxelize it. So once we've created our cutter object, I'm just going to actually hit Shift C here to go and create a group. And let's call this cutter object. There we go. So now let's drag this voxelize out here. Actually, you know what? I'll go and drag our original shape first, my bad. And let's look for mesh Boolean. So this is going to really allow us to do the cutting now. So we want to make sure that mesh A is going to be our original rock shape, and mesh B is going to be the output from this voxelize. So now if I double click on this to select it, you'll see that we can see both of the objects here. If I just click away, you can see that we have our sphere and our voxelized. Now what I'd like to do is instead of union, let's go and select difference. And then we also have to turn this, this preview option off. I'm not really sure why this is on by default. I guess it just shows you both the meshes, but it's kind of annoying. So now if I click in my graph to get rid of those GUI, you can see that we're going to get this Boolean shape. And it's going to give us some interesting kind of like rock-like surfaces, right? We're getting more faceted faces alongside some also kind of like smoother areas as well. Now it's pretty rough. It's not ideal yet, but we're going to be iterating on it again to kind of refine what the shape will look like. Now that's going to be our base shape. We can go and generate a couple different designs if we wanted to, say come back to the scatter on topology. We can play with this seed here to get different types of kind of curvature and like ruggedness from this shape. We can get pretty much an entirely new rock. I'm also going to just crank this up to maybe something like 11. That's going to give us something kind of cool and rocky here. If I can orbit around this correctly, here we go. That's looking really neat. And these are going to be parameters we could go ahead and export or expose from this graph here that we can use in other graphs when we want to generate this shape, which is really cool. But where we want to go from here is that this shape is not really well optimized, I'll say. I'm going to toggle my wireframe here and we'll take a look. You can see that we've got a lot of just like really bad triangles kind of along some of the areas, like, yeah, especially right in these kind of areas. They're just going to look really bad. It's going to look really low quality, and we're not going to want to pretty much bake out height maps and textures using something that's just kind of low polygon like this. So how we go about remeshing this is pretty much exactly how we just saw down here for our cutter object. So let's bring out another mesh voxelize and use that. And let's see what this looks like. So not ideal. And there is a reason for that, but I'm going to hold on to that for a little bit. We're going to see what it is in a second here. But this is a good first pass. Again, just looking at the difference between this here and this here, you can see it's kind of ballooned it up a little bit. Now you can go ahead and change the resolution to kind of help mitigate that. You can see we're getting much more faceted edges, kind of more true to what the original shape was. But I'm going to bring this back down to 16 because it really bogs down our system. And we're going to re-voxelize it here in a second to kind of get the high poly quality that we're looking for. Now what I'd like to do, actually I'm going to leave my overlay here, our wireframe overlay on for a minute. I want to go ahead and merge some of these vertices that are really close to one another. So let's just look for mesh weld vertices. And now if we take a look, we'll have the ability to change how far away verts are before they get welded. So you can see even something as low as 0.33 is maybe a little too much. Let's bring that back to maybe 0.1. Right, and it's going to weld some of those kind of like duplicated, unnecessary verts. So we're going to have something kind of like this. And actually, I don't really like these areas here. Maybe let's try 0.1, 2. Yeah, something like that. Ultimately, it's not really going to matter because the next step we're doing is, again, voxelizing this shape. So let's go and do a mesh voxelize and take a look again. And now what I'd like to do is crank up our resolution to something like 60. So if I turn off my wireframe overlay here, right, we're getting something kind of closer to what we had initially, but it's got much cleaner topology because we don't have any kind of like overlapped verts or verts that don't have an edge associated with them, like any n-gons and stuff like that. So it's going to be a lot cleaner here. Now, one thing I'd also like to do is kind of smooth out the shape a little bit. For the look I was going for, it was more like river rocks. So they're kind of worn down, right? Water has kind of just smoothed them out over time. They're not really going to be super jagged rocks. But that could be a good idea for a tutorial maybe down the line, or even using this generator here, if you can figure out how to do some kind of cool jagged rocks. So once we've voxelized, welded, and voxelized again, let's go and use a mesh smooth node here. And what this will do is, based on the intensity, kind of just like smooth everything out, right? It's kind of like a blur is to an image, and like what a smooth is to a 3D mesh. So in my studying, I found that around an intensity of 1 was kind of what I wanted. It just kind of adds some of that roundedness into the shape. And now the final step we're going to need to do in this grouping here is we're going to need to recalculate the normals. So that's something to be aware of when we're working in InstaMAT with meshes, is that some of these operations don't actually recalculate the normals. So you could be using normal information for the shading from like an older step in your chain that doesn't really look good. And for this particular one, I don't think it does look good. Now you'll notice that the voxelize nodes, I believe, do recalculate the normals. But we've also since then gone ahead and done another step. And so we need to update the normals for the shading to reflect this operation. So let's just search for normals. And I'd like to do a mesh calculate normal. So you can see it just recalculates the vertex normals. So now when I add this and I take a look, right, it looks a little bit smoother. We don't have those kind of like jaggedy edges as much. You'll see that it also does maybe kind of take away some of those like more faceted angles of the faces, but again, for the overall look of this rock, this is kind of more the desired look that I was going for. And so that's going to kind of complete our remesh section of this. So let's go ahead again, do Shift C, and we can add this to our group called remesh. Now, next up on our hit list of things to get done for the mesh portion of the video is I'd like to add some type of like disturbance or displacement to the surface of this mesh. We're going to do that later on with the texturing portion, but why wait until that point, right? We can also go ahead and kind of disturb the mesh a little bit and add some detail to it while we're here. So in order to do that, we need to come over to where we've just calculated our normals. And what I'd like to do first is we need to give InstaMAT a way to understand how to use the image we're about to provide it, because we're going to be displacing this with a built-in noise node. So by default, this isn't going to have any UVs attached to it, right? We've gone and remeshed it essentially a couple times. So there's not going to be any UV information left on this. So we need InstaMAT to determine what those UVs will look like for us. And fortunately, we have a node to do exactly that. So let's drag this out and start to type in UV unwrap. You can see it's mesh UV unwrap here. We also have a packing option, which is kind of cool. If I select this, it's not really going to do anything to our mesh itself, right? You can see that the mesh looks exactly the same, and we don't have the ability to view the UV within this node for some reason. It would be kind of nice if we could see that actually. So the way that we can see this is unwrapped is if I go and drag this out and start to type in mesh UV. And it should be down here under property, right? So it generates a UV map. So now you can see that we do indeed actually have a UV unwrap for this object. And that's actually a pretty good pack, I've got to say. It's a lot of texture space being used, which is really sweet. Now we don't actually need this UV node, so we can go and delete that, but I just wanted to show you this is now actually unwrapped once we use any output from this node here. So to incorporate some displacement, let's go and drag out our mesh UV unwrap socket, and I'll start to type in displacement, and we're looking for mesh displacement node. So this is going to, again, kind of do some of that displacement to our geometry. We can see that we've got this kind of just like random noise.png plugged in by default. And so it's doing a pretty good job of adding some intricacies to our model, but it's not quite exactly the type of noise we want to do. You'll also see too that it looks kind of soft. Well, I don't know why InstaMAT keeps doing that, but you'll notice as I get to a certain point, it kind of snaps me back to the top or the bottom. So I apologize for that. But you'll see that it's getting kind of soft around some of these edges, depending on the angle you're looking at. And again, I just want to reiterate how important it is to constantly be having to recalculate your normals when you do different procedures on your mesh. So again, that is just an issue with displacing vertices, but not actually recalculating normals. So it's using the shading as if we haven't used the displacement. Oh my goodness, speech again, not my my strong suit. And it's using the shading normals from this unwrap. So let's just go and drag out a mesh calculate normals node, and let's view this. And this is going to look a lot more true to what the type of shading we're going to want. So I'm just going to visualize this node in our 3D view, but we're going to be working on this displacement. So we'll see that it offers us the ability to input a displacement, and it is going to be of a grayscale image. So this is where we start to combine some 2D and 3D together. And I don't remember if I said we're not doing any 2D stuff in this particular graph. Surprise, I lied, my bad. Yeah, so what we can do is drag out our socket and we can incorporate really any noise we want. Now, I found one that I really liked called Stone Noise. I think it's rather topical given what we're working on here. And we'll see that it's going to give us some of that higher frequency noise. So it's not those big kind of lumps that we had by default. Now, with our displacement selected, we'll also have the ability to kind of cast this displacement outwards. But what is maybe not as obvious is that we can actually work in the inverted direction. Now, what we could do is maybe try and like invert this noise and then try and do that. But it's just as easy to come in here and do something like maybe negative 0.1. And now we're starting to cut inwards on the rock. And this is more the look I want to go for, is I want to keep some of that roundedness, and I want to just kind of cut away from, you know, some of those faces there to get some of that like ribbed, like bumpy kind of look. Now I feel it's maybe a little too like high frequency. So what I'd like to do is also just drop the stone noise scale to something like maybe 3 or even 2. Yeah, I think 2 is going to work well. I think that scale kind of suits the size of the rock here. Now, really, that's going to be it for our displacement. It's pretty simple, just a couple of nodes. But if you want to go ahead and maybe increase, boost up the resolution of this mesh here, maybe you think it's a little too low poly, where you'd want to do that is if we come back here to this second mesh voxelize node, if you were to go ahead and increase this resolution, that's going to bump up the resolution that you're seeing here and allow the displacement to have more vertices to work with, so you can get much finer detail. Now, I would personally recommend or advise against that, just because we want to have something that looks good and it's got a decent number of polygons. But now we're about to close out this generator node that we're creating here. And I tell you, if we start using multiple of these generators and they're cranked up to really high resolutions, you are going to bring whatever graph you bring these into to an absolute crawl. So we're trying to balance quality with resolution here. But I just wanted to do a bit of a call out just in case you find that yours maybe looks a little bit low res. So now that we've got our displacement out of the way, where we've gone and calculated our normals, let's go ahead and set this rock output. So I'm going to type in rock mesh. And now there is not going to be a rock mesh node that we're using. What I'd like to do is actually set an output parameter from this graph, which is going to be the mesh itself. So if I select this expose, right, that's going to give us an output. You'll see that it's given us this output up top here. Now, if I was to bring this graph into any other graphs, we'll be able to access this mesh that we see here and use it for really whatever purposes we want. Now, there is one more thing I'd like to output from this graph, and it is a like two-dimensional projection that we can use for more image-based processing. I probably didn't explain that well, but bear with me here. We'll see what that means in just a second. So what I'm going to do is drag this out, and I'm going to type in mesh render. And the one I'm looking for is mesh render depth. And if we take a look at the description, right, it's going to just render like a height map essentially from this 3D mesh using whatever type of projection we want. So I'll select that, and we can see now we're getting effectively a height map or like a depth projection of this model here. And we can change how the camera is viewing this. And it's pretty quick. It's pretty fast, right? Because we do have a bit of a lower resolution. But this is really, really cool and really handy for creating some of these rocks on the fly, given all of the other parameters that we can go ahead and tweak as well. Now, there are a couple things I'd like to set up with this node first. If I come on down to the scene, that's going to be the camera here. You can see that as I drag this GUI around, right, it's changing how we're viewing this rock essentially. but I want to view this from top down, right? So our like Y positive axis here. So what I'd like to do, maybe I'll just bring this out a little bit so we can see all of the little options here, is let's do negative 90 on the X. So we're getting that top-down view. You can also go and change this to orthographic, right? You get maybe a bit of a flatter looking perspective for this rock, but I think leaving it on perspective was more than enough. I'm also going to change our FOV from 60 to maybe around 40, so it's taking up a lot more of our render space, right? So that we don't have to try and stretch this out using a transformation 2D node in any graph that we bring this into. And now that's looking pretty good. The final thing I would like to do with this node though, and it's not going to make a whole lot of sense now, but trust me, it's going to save us a lot of trouble down the line, is I want to drag up the depth input level on the bottom end here. So I'm going to click the little pencil here, and let's change this from 0 to 0.1. You'll see that it's made kind of the sides and really overall a little bit darker. And if I go and change this from linear to exponential, you can see that it's going to even dramatically increase that effect. By default with linear and a 0 to 1 range, it's kind of not very rock-like when we're trying to blend this in later on. And you will see later in the video as well, I do a lot of auto leveling because the default height or depth render that we get from this is just really flat. You don't get a lot of the curvature of the rock when we're starting to blend it in a material level. So by changing this to exponential and just increasing the bottom level of the input levels, this is going to really help us pronounce the shape and the curvature of these rocks later on. So now that we have that, let's go and just drag this out. And what I'd like to do is I'm going to type in, actually, you know what, I'll just call it depth. And again, we're going to expose depth as a graph output. And we can see that now we're going to get this render here. And if I go ahead, double click on that, bring it up in our image editor here. This is going to be the image or the grayscale render for the height that we're going to be able to get out of this node now. Now, before we move on, what I would encourage you to do is if you're comfortable enough with it, go back into our little baby graph here that we've created and find some of the parameters that you like to kind of tweak, you know, the surface value or the resolution. You can even come into this node here and play around with this camera orientation, right? If we want to change how we can like orbit around these rocks and change maybe the projection and the height that we're getting from it, these would be very useful parameters for us to have on the outside of this graph, that when we bring this into another graph, we can actually access these. Now I'm going to leave it for the sake of this video. Again, it's not really what I want to showcase, but definitely take a look at doing that on your end. And if you want to learn how to expose parameters for things like this, again, make sure to check out that initial brick video I was talking about at the beginning of this one. And again, link in the description below. That's going to cover the mesh portion of this video. Now, I know, again, this does look like just one type of rock, but we have the ability to play around with the variations of this rock here and create pretty much an infinite number of rocks just with one small graph. Now let's go and create a new graph here. Create an element graph without a template, and we'll call this rock field. And this is where we're going to start to do all of our material work. We'll go back to our graph view, bring our 3D over here. And I'm just going to quickly switch this over to a plane high. And this is where we're going to start to visualize what we've got going on for our material. Now, I just quickly want to make sure that our rock generator node works. So I'm going to hit space and start to type in rock. And because it's all within the same package, I can go and very easily just type in the name of that graph. We can see rock mesh here. It's even going to show us one of the outputs that we have for this. So if I select that and just let it generate, again, you can see it's taken quite a bit for a 4K graph. You can imagine how maybe having 10 of these in a graph, all with crazy, insane resolution, is really going to bog down your machine. But now we have the ability to view the depth for this rock. And we can also, if I click on this, visualize the rock in 3D. And we can actually see that it is, I believe, a different rock, even entirely from what we had just seen from the graph itself. Now I can go and just change some of the seed parameters for this rock mesh, and it should update accordingly for both of our outputs as well. So hopefully, I know I keep harping on it, but this really is a cool, flexible, functional workflow here in InstaMAT, blending together 3D and 2D. Fantastic. So hopefully I haven't lost you so far. I've gone ahead and set up a normal and ambient occlusion outputs, and just using the height to those particular texture map outputs. Just quickly, if we're not familiar with how to do this, we can go into our outputs by single clicking on the background of a graph, adding a new parameter. And in this case, I'm going to use the height map or create a height map output. So that's going to be element image gray is the data type here in InstaMAT. And let's go and just quickly rename this to height. And you can see that as I start to type this in, it actually recognizes what I'm typing in as one of the viewable texture maps here in InstaMAT. So if we want to visualize this output as a height map and use that as displacement here in our 3D view, we need to make sure we actually name it height here. So now that we've set that, I can go and just drag this there. And you might have seen, go back and maybe just rewind the video a second ago, it actually added some displacement here. So we can see that by turning this off and on. So just another kind of easy and quick way to see how we're starting to texture our material and start to layer up some of our height maps. So now to start this off, let's go and drag our rock mesh back. And what I'd like to do is first create a couple different, well, we're going to start with one, but eventually create a couple different rock piles. And this is all going to be using the 3D rock mesh that we've exposed here. So if I click on this again, you can see there's going to be a little bit of chaoticness going on. The reason for that, if we turn off our displacement, is that it's actually taking the texture outputs here and displaying them on our 3D model, even though it is the rock mesh. So let's just ignore the textures for now. We're just looking at the mesh itself here. So with the mesh output, I'm going to drag this out and I'm going to type mesh drop on topology. So this is the node we're going to look for here. And what I'd like to do is actually take this and let's just put this into the scatter mesh. And the mesh itself that we're going to do at the top here is the mesh that we're actually dropping things onto. So it might make more sense if I click on the output. You can see that we have this cube. And if you zoom in, right, we've got all those individual, it might be a little hard to zoom in here, but you can see that we've got that rock kind of dropping on the top of this cube. Now what I'm going to do is change this cube mesh. I don't want it to be a cube. I'd rather have it as a plane. So I'm going to do the mesh shape generator very quickly. Plug that in. And let's make sure to set this to plane. And I'm going to do a width of 2 and a depth of 2. And I got to make sure that I've got this actually selected so I'm not just changing everything. There we go. So now if we zoom in, you can see that we have, again, ignoring the textures, but we have all of these rocks actually being dropped essentially on the surface of this plane. And we're starting to create a bit of a pile. Now that's neat, but if we go and take a look at some of the parameters for this, we can actually change the amount of rocks we're scattering so that we're not just dropping the same rock over and over again, basically, right? It's going to get very repetitive. And as we can see, we're also getting a lot of intersection. So first things first, let's go and change the scatter mesh amount to be 3. And then what I'll do is I'm going to take this rock mesh and holding Alt and then left click and drag, we'll just create a new instance of this. And you can see that it's a totally different rock, right? Generated randomly. And I'll plug that in. And I'll do the same exact thing again, just dragging out another one so that we have 3 separate rock meshes, all, very different from one another, but still following some of the similar parameters that we have. So we've got that set up. The next thing I'd like to do is come on down to this append input, and you'll see that if we turn that off, we get rid of that plane mesh. So we don't really want the plane mesh in the final output, but we need it to provide as a mesh to actually drop things on. So that's really useful. And then finally, I would like to go and also enable cancellation. So we can see that this is going to help prevent those intersections of those rocks. So if I enable this, and then I maybe bring the radius up, you can see that as I drag it up, right, we start to remove a lot of that intersection. So I don't know, maybe something like 7's too low, 8, 10. Yeah, I think I'm willing to live with 10. I think 10's all right. And now we can also change the amount here on the count option. If I change this to like 80, you'll see that we're going to get a lot more of those rocks. And it's a little tough to kind of orbit around this here because it's so small, but that's starting to look pretty cool. Now we're going to notice that our pile is in a relatively square distribution based off of the plane mesh that we provided it. And what I'd like to do is kind of break that up a little bit and make it look a little more organic. So to do that, down towards the bottom, we have the random transform section. And this is going to allow us to create those random values for rotation and position and all that. You can see it's already got a couple on by default so that the rocks are kind of turned as well. Now the translation or the position is a little bit weird. I'm not exactly certain why this is. If we take a look in our 3D view, we can see that the y-axis is vertical. And we can also see that the drop up axis and the mesh up axis is the y-axis. However, if I start to move this y slider here, you'll see that it actually looks like it's moving on the z-axis. I don't know if that's just like a glitch or a bug or something, or if I'm doing something wrong. Please let me know in the comments below if you know what I'm kind of messing up. But that makes this next part just kind of a little bit weird because I don't really want to increase too much on the vertical. I want to keep it rather horizontal and just move the positions kind of, across those two axes. So for the minimum x, I'll do -1. And for the positive, I'll do a positive 1, right? So we've increased the random kind of positions for this. And instead of doing the Z, because we'll see that the Z is going to bring it up or down, I'm instead going to do the Y. So -1 and 1. We're getting a little bit more randomness outside of just that square distribution. And now I'm going to bring it up on the Z or the Y axis in our 3D view just a little bit, but only in the positive direction. So for our maximum translation, let's see, what does a value of 1 give us? That might be a little bit too much, so let's do something like 0.5. So that we're just still getting a little bit of variation with our axes here. And I'm actually going to decrease this just down to maybe 1K to help it load a little bit faster. If you're finding that you have a little bit of performance issues, try just decreasing your graph resolution and it should be relatively quicker. Again, depending on the resolution of your meshes that you created in your node is really going to determine how fast this is going to move for us. You can see that we've got quite a number of polygons here and vertices just on this node alone. Now, I'm not going to bore you with the rest of the details here. I just wanted to make sure that we knew what we were doing for the translate, but go ahead and play around with the rotation and the scale. This is going to allow you to really tweak and fine tune just kind of the variation of each individually dropped rock so that we're getting as much variation out of this pile as we can. And then once you've gone ahead and done that, go and drag out 2 new copies of this scatter so that we have 3 mesh drop on topology nodes altogether. So just quickly, here is what I've done with mine. You can see that they're pretty tight knit, right? We want to make them look like they're a bit of a rubble pile. So we want them to be very close together and kind of have that central mass towards the center. But we'd also like to have some negative space as well so that we can see some rocks piling underneath as we start to layer these. And so I've done that for each one of these just with a different seed essentially. Now, these are still in mesh form. We need to now convert these into textures so we can start creating our material. So to do that, first what I'm going to do is bring everything back, bring it over here, give us some space between our outputs. And I'm also going to just create a group for these, and we can call this mesh pile, something like that, whatever means something to you. And now what we can do on our mesh drop on topology is drag this out and start to type in render. And the node we're looking for is mesh render depth. So we've seen this already, right? When we went and created the output for the rock nodes. So this shouldn't be too new for us. And what I'd like to do is very similar to what we did just previously. So first, let's go and change the camera orientation on the X to be -90. So we're getting that straight down look. I'm also going to change my camera type to be orthographic so that we're getting kind of a more top-down flatter look. So we're not losing any of the scale necessarily between these rocks. They're keeping kind of in proportion with one another. I'm going to change my manual scene size. I'm going to change the object scale up as well so that we can fit just the bounds of this area here. And then finally, what I want to do is change the depth mode as well. So if we bring this over to, I guess it doesn't really matter, we'll just leave it on linear. I'm going to increase the depth input levels on the bottom end. And my notes say something around 0.35 so that we're getting some darkness and variation, right? If we go back before, you can see there's really not a lot of height variation between these. So it's going to be pretty flat when we try and create a height map from this. So something like 0.35 kind of brings back some of that depth. And now if I change these modes, yeah, again, it doesn't really change anything. It might be because it's an orthographic. So that's looking cool. And then what we can do is just bring out an auto levels node. So now if I bring up my 2D view here, this is what we're going to get. And this is our first rock pile. So go ahead, duplicate these over for the next two so that we have all 3 of our rock piles or however many rock piles you made at this level. Now, something I also forgot to mention with these auto level nodes is that I want to also increase the luminance balance all the way up to 1. And you'll see what that does is just further help us differentiate some of the height scale for these. If we take a look here, we'll see that as I crank this up, you can see a lot of the rocks start to sink into the background a little bit. And this is really useful, again, to just help layer these rocks. So I'll just increase all these to 1. And now that we're here and you kind of maybe realize, oh, you know what, I don't actually like what this pile looks like, we can just quickly go back to our drop on topology nodes and play around with the parameters or even quickly change the seed. And you can see I'm very rapidly getting totally different piles of rocks here. We can even maybe decrease this down to something like 16, so it's a lot smaller. in terms of number. Now we might have to go and just change the object scale to better match. But whenever you find something that you like, you have the ability to tweak it and finesse it or fine tune it a little bit. So once we are happy with these, I'm going to just take them and push them up and out of the way because we're not going to use them for a little bit, because I want to first lay down a base rock layer. And with these piles, it's just a little too noisy. What I'd like to do is take these original 3 rocks and use these as that base layer, and then we're going to build these piles around them. So let's go and create a guided scatter node, this one right here. So this will let us scatter our inputs just kind of randomly, and it's much like a tile sampler node is in Substance Designer. I'm going to take that, switch it to grayscale since we have grayscale inputs. Now let's change the input amount. You can see that we only have 1 input here. So if we come on down to pattern, we'll be able to change that here. I don't love that this is kind of hidden, just my 2 cents. So if you're having a hard time trying to figure out how to have more inputs, it's all the way down in this pattern header. Now if I drag that up, we'll be able to add a couple more. So I'm going to take the grayscale render of each one of these rocks and just drag that in. I don't want to view it, I want to drag it in. There we go. So now we're getting our scatter of these rocks. Now we're going to be changing a whole bunch of settings on this node, but you don't have to follow exactly what I'm doing. If you have kind of a clear idea in mind of what you want to do, honestly, just go to town, play around with all of these parameters and see what you can get. But in my testing, I found that these options kind of worked well for me. So I'm going to change the count from 4 to 5. So we're going to have a 5 by 5 grid here. I'm going to also go back up to color. And the blend mode I want to use is going to be maximum. Now, none of these are really intersecting. Actually, you could kind of see it down here. If I change this back to default, you can see that it's using kind of like an alpha or just a bounding box of this rock to kind of cut out that area. And that's not going to look good, especially in a height map. So using the maximum blending mode is going to allow us to almost have these appear as if they're intersecting, or at least not completely removing data or overriding it. It's going to be based off of the value or the brightness of the pixels, and whatever is brighter is going to be displayed essentially. So it just is a nicer, cleaner way to blend these together if they do intersect. Next up on our list, I want to come on down to position, because a 5 by 5 grid is probably not the ideal random rock bed. But to change this up, what I want to do is use this offset variance. So I'm going to just set this up to maybe a value of 2, right? So it's very disturbed and very random. That's seen some things. And I also want to play around with the size. So again, we can play with the size variance. Now I want to make sure that I lock this because I don't want to get some weird kind of like stretch rocks. You can see if you play with just one of the sliders, it's not going to be ideal for this particular input. So I'm going to make sure that it's locked. And let's set it to around 0.5. So we're going to get some bigger, some smaller. Now what's really cool about InstaMAT is it has a minimum size slider as well. So if there is kind of a minimum size, say these rocks get way too small, right? If we increase this randomness up. And we're not at the point where we want to introduce pebbles necessarily. What this minimum slider is going to allow us to do is actually set a minimum so that we can still have that randomness of 1, but the minimum scale of these is going to be 0.53. So no rock is going to be smaller than that. So it essentially sets like a clamp or a cap at the bottom value, which is really useful because a lot of times when you use this random slider in really any application with a randomness value, it oftentimes makes things way too small when it comes to scale. And then it's a bit of a battle trying to scale it up and then, playing with the randomness and then scaling it up. It's just a lot of back and forth. So this is really useful for our application here. And I think in my testing, I set a value of maybe 0.4, just in case anything got smaller than that, but I don't think anything sized up. So we should be good to go. We can also uniformly change the scale of all of these, which is then going to override all of these size parameters. And I might set this down to something like 0.35. And we'll see I actually didn't lock this. So if I lock that there now, it's not going to be kind of like weirdly non-uniform scaled. So I'm just going to quickly go ahead and play with my offset. Maybe set this up to something like 5, just so I'm not having things intersecting as much. And now just playing with the seed, I'm going to try and find something that's kind of nicely distributed. And actually that's looking pretty cool. So I think I'm going to stick with this here. Now let's just run this through an auto levels node, making sure that we're following kind of everything we've been doing previously. So I might just crank that up so that we're getting some of that roundedness off the top so it's not as flat. And again, we're probably going to be using an auto levels for almost all of the height map nodes that we create, just because it really starts to level out those values a lot nicer for this particular material. So now that we have our base layer set up, let's bring that down. And I'm going to bring everything back again, just so we have more space to work. I'll bring these back down here. And what I'd like to do is do the exact same thing that we just did previously with those base layers, but we're going to do it for our piles now. So let's use a guided scatter again, now that we've got warmed up a little bit. And I'm going to use a grayscale. And let's add a couple more patterns. And now we can plug our piles into this guy here. And let's take a look. Right, so we're getting our 4x4 with our piles, which is looking kind of cool. And I want to set up our blending color as well to be maximum. This is really going to help us when they start to clash, because in this particular scatter node, they're going to clash, and we kind of want it to. That's going to help us layer these a lot nicer. And now let's go down to our position and scale. And I'm going to scale these up, and I'm going to do it with our bottom slider here, right? So that the rocks are starting to kind of scatter in with each other. And if we take a look, right, they're starting to intersect kind of nicely because of our maximum blending mode. I'm also going to just increase the variance here. Maybe not that much, actually. Let's do something like 0.5. I'll even change the variance in the orientation to maybe be like 2. Right, this is just the rotation of it, essentially. And then we can play with the seed until we get something that we kind of like. And I want to have something that takes up most of the space here, but still having some of those negative areas as well. Actually, maybe I'll just increase the scale of this. Again, something like that. So that's looking all right. Now we have these two scatter nodes, and right now they exist independently of one another. Right, we have our base layer with our big rocks. We've got our guided scatter with our smaller rocks. Let's actually run this through an auto levels as well, making sure that we're following consistency. And you can see again, right, it just brings those back down so that they're not all just one value and flat. So now we need to think about how we're going to meld these two maps together, these two images. And the way that we can do that, again, if you're familiar with Substance Designer, is by using a height blend node, or in InstaMAT called blend height. That's going to be the bane of your existence if you are switching over from software, because I consistently am looking for height blend, And if you look for that, you get nothing. But if you look for blend height, well, there you have it. Same exact node, just spelt with the words reversed. Going to be a real pain in the butt for the muscle memory people out there. But the idea of this node, if we bring our auto levels together, is pretty much as follows. We have a bottom input, we have a top input, and we also have a mask. We're not going to be looking at the mask because we want to blend these uniformly across each other. And hopefully the naming conventions for these are relatively straightforward, right? If we have our base layer, that's likely going to be on the bottom. These are the big pieces that maybe came first and then the smaller rocks followed. And we also have the top, which is going to be our smaller piles. Now we have something like this, where we've got a blending of both of these here. Now, there's a couple things that are useful about this node. First of all, in its parameters, right, we can change the offset of the height for both of these independently, so we can have more of a prioritize the bottom layer or the top layer by changing the offsets here. We can also change the opacity of the blend as well. There's a bunch of different options that we can do here to help us blend these nicer. One major reason why I like to use this blend height node in particular is because of the outputs here. Now, first off, we have the output of the blend, but we also have a mask. So if we take a look here, you can see that I'm getting a mask for everything that's plugged into the top layer minus the bottom. So if we take a look, right, you can see these big black spots, right, are actually rocks from the top input. So it effectively creates this mask where we can start to blend these together. But if we need to texture these differently, say we want to have a different color on these base rocks versus the smaller rocks, we can use this mask here to help differentiate between these. So that's going to be useful down the line. And what's really neat about this in InstaMAT as well is that it also has an intersection mask. Now, I haven't personally found a reason to use this yet, but I like the idea of it. And I think at some point I'll find kind of a really great use case for this. And it's something that you can even change in the node itself. As you can see, you can change kind of that intersection range. But we're not going to be using it in this tutorial. I just thought it's kind of something neat to point out. Now from here, what I want to do is create another layer. This is going to be our third layer of rocks because as we can see, we still have quite a bit of space. And the idea is that we're working from, and I maybe should have mentioned this a little earlier, working from the largest rock down towards kind of the smallest pebble. That's how we're working here. It's going to make things way easier to blend. And it just makes sense in terms of how it would form, right? You'd have some of the larger aspects first, and eventually over time, some of the smaller rocks would start to fill in those gaps. So instead of reinventing the wheel, we're going to use what we already have. I'm going to take this scatter node and I will just Alt and click out to create another one. And what we're going to do is just increase the count up to something like 6. Right, so very quickly gone and bam, created much smaller rocks. Now I'm going to maybe just drag these down so it's a little more visible and easy to see what we're doing, right? First layer, second layer, third layer. So let's create an auto levels node for this. And I will just increase the luminosity there. And let's just go and drag out this blend height. And we can just get rid of those connections there. So now what we're going to do is use the result of this blend height, not the mask, the output, as the bottom. And now we're going to place these smaller pebbles over top. So now if I just double click on that, and drag this into the top, right, you can see we're starting to fill in our material here. And if you don't like how this is blending, or you don't like, maybe the scale needs to be a little bit smaller, we can always come back, change our count to something like, let's do maybe 8, right? And something like that might work a little bit better for what you're doing. I actually think I maybe want to bring this up to 7, just so we're getting some differentiation there. But again, we might have to come back and change this later. So now might also be a good time to start visualizing this in our 3D view. So let's go and switch our mesh down here. So I'm going to do load mesh, and I'm going to select plane high. So this will allow us to start visualizing our material on a nice flat surface. So let's bring this output over to our outputs over here. If I just drag and drop that in, we'll be able to see very quickly what we have started to create. And that's actually looking pretty good, considering we really haven't seen it in 3D up until this point. So taking a look back on our graph so far, this is what we've done to create everything that we can see in our 3D view. And I'm going to bring back in our displacement. It just adds a little bit more of that realism. I'm also going to crank up our graph to 2K again, now that we're not visualizing those rock meshes. So it's probably a good time now, if you want to bring up the resolution again, to do that, because those rock meshes were pretty dense. And taking just a quick 1/over on our material here, I think it's looking good. A lot of the details are coming through even at 2K. Now something I want to do is again just add a 4th layer, which is going to kind of fill in a lot of these gaps and just be really, really small rocks. And the way that we're going to do that, we could go and just repeat the process that we've been doing, but I just want to show you different ways that you could go about doing this. And so we're going to do a bit of a quick and dirty way to achieve this here. What I'm going to do is bring this out and use a transform node. And this will just allow us to, move, rotate, scale, do whatever we want. I'm just going to reset all of that transformation there. Because what I want to do is I'm just going to take the scale of this and we're going to scale it by half. So it's going to essentially be this here, but much smaller. I'm also going to rotate it 90 degrees, and you could type it in there. Something cool that I learned as well is if you right click on this, you're also going to get this little GUI, which is really neat. And if you hold down Control, it actually lets you snap at 15-degree increments. So now if I release and click in here, we've done 90 degrees. So we've just scaled it down and basically turned this here. Now, yet again, we need to do an auto levels. Make sure this kind of balances everything here. So a lot of those smaller rocks are going to be pretty much non-existent once we blend this back in. And using another blend height node, making sure that I hold down Control. There we go. Drop that in there. And now take this and plug this in over top. Now looking at my 3D view, it looks like the top rocks are maybe just a little too high up on our grayscale value. So what I'm going to do is actually in our auto levels, I'm going to take the value of our output levels down until these kind of sit a little nicer in our 3D here. So somewhere from like maybe 0.5 and down kind of fits a little nicer. If we just take a quick look, here's what we had previously, and here's what we have now. And that's really helped fill in kind of that rock field that we have going on here. Now, I know I said the last layer was going to be our final one, but I'm a dirty liar. Someone should arrest me because we're doing one more. That was the last rock layer. This is our first and last pebble layer, if we want to make the differentiation. Realistically, I just wanted to show you yet another way that we could go about just filling in some of these gaps again. Because as we take a look, I'm sure yours is going to be relatively similar. and that we do have some of these kind of non-filled areas. So we want to fill them with just some kind of areas of interest, or like something that we can just kind of put in there and look kind of cool. So in order to do this, let's go all the way back to where we have our base layer with our individual rock inputs. And I'm going to duplicate both of these. So Alt and then left clicking to drag this all the way back out and over. And what I want to do is let's increase the count to something like 80. We're getting a lot of tiny little rocks. And then let's go and do a blend height, if I can spell. There we go. Making sure that it plugs it in the bottom, not the top, and then taking the top all the way to our auto levels. And I did the bottom again. So one more time, taking the top. There we go. So that's probably around the right scale for our pebbles, but it certainly is not the right value or height offsets. As we can see, those are very peaked rocks. So there's a couple different things I want to do with this to help us kind of push those pebbles into the right areas and also decrease their height scale. What I'd like to do is take our guided scatter and let's use one of these custom inputs. So let's use a mask input so that we can kind of tell it where to get rid of rocks and where to keep them. And in order to determine that, what I'd like to do is use the areas from our previous blend where we have pretty much no rocks, right? These black dark areas, and use that as basically our mask. Let's drag out a blur. First of all, I just want to kind of blur it a little bit, make it a little smoother. And then I also want to run this through an invert node. And the reason that is the way that these guided scatter masks work is that areas that are white are going to denote areas that these rocks can be scattered, and black areas are going to denote areas that they're going to be removed. So that doesn't really make sense with what we have currently, right? Because the white areas are where the rocks are. We don't want those tiny pebbles to spawn on the rocks. So we just need to invert that. Now we can drag our output from the invert up to our mask. And you'll see that's already started to help a little bit. And if we come into our mask options here as well, we can change the threshold of kind of like that grayscale. That's why we blurred it to kind of fine tune that mask a little bit here. Maybe something like 0.7 for now. We can also decrease the density. So this is going to just kind of randomly, after we've masked them off, randomly just start to eliminate some of those rocks as well if we find that there's too many. So we can do maybe, I don't know, 0.65, whatever kind of works for your material. So that's looking all right in terms of distribution, but again, we still need to kind of fine tune some of the height offset here. And so that's where I'm going to come into our auto levels. And like we'd seen before, let's just decrease our output levels here until it's something a little more agreeable, maybe something like 0.37. And that's why I really like working with this displacement on. It's a little bit easier to see that overall kind of like height offset from everything just by having a little bit of vertex displacement. And so that's looking really cool. Again, we can change the density if we find that that's maybe not enough. And even the threshold, if we find that maybe we want to have these pebbles start to kind of creep up a little bit more. And actually what I might do is also just come up and increase this, maybe do something like 0.6. Yeah, I think that's looking pretty cool. Fantastic. So hopefully that wasn't too challenging for you. You were able to get something that you like, and make sure to tweak some of these parameters. But before we move on, get it to something that is looking more like how you'd want it, because that's going to conclude the height map section of this video, we're going to look at creating the base color albedo layer now. So down here at the final blend height node, I've moved our reroute node back because I'm going to use this to also drive the color map as well. So to start that off, let's go and drag out a gradient map. If we take a look, we're going to get this weird looking kind of gradient map here. What I'd like to do is switch this from grayscale to color. So now it's going to be a fully color node, right? We're going to use color for the color map. And I'm going to get rid of this green handle. So what I'm going to do is select one of these handles. I'll do the left one first. And I'm going to just eyedropper a color off of my screen here on my second monitor. So if I can grab it, it's going to be a bit of a kind of like grayish brown color. And then for our blue, I'll do the same thing. I'm just going to quickly grab a kind of like midish gray color, something like that. I'm not sure why it looks so dark. If I go back, there we go. So we're going to get something that looks kind of like this, just a soft gradient that's going to kind of give us a starting base for our color. So once we have that, let's make sure we can actually start visualizing this in our 3D view. So I'm going to drag that out. I'm going to type in base color, just like that. Spelling is going to be important, so just make sure you spell it the way that I have it here. And we can double click that. And now that should, in theory, show up in our 3D viewport. And if you want to check the different channel outputs, what you can do is hit C on your keyboard to preview some of these channels. So you can see that we're previewing this base color node. We can also cycle through the different channel outputs that we have in this graph. And once you're done and you want to go back to regular 3D PBR view, just hit the M key to bring back your material view, M for material. So I'll bring my base color now over here and set that up. And let's go ahead and start layering some stuff onto this. So I'm going to bring in a blend node. And I'll just hit Control to steal that connection so that we can put it there. And what I'd like to do is bring in just kind of like a random omnidirectional noise to kind of just add some variation to some of the surfaces of these rocks. So I'm going to use just a very simple clouds heavy node. You can see it's just like a fractal noise. And what I'd like to do with this, if we just take a look, is just kind of run it through another process to kind of help break up some of this noise. Right now, it still looks pretty, I feel, procedural. And there's a filter that we can run this through that's going to help break that up a little bit, which is going to be the fractal, if I could spell it, fractal warp node. So now if I do this, it makes it a little splotchier and a little more, I think, kind of like organic. So it doesn't feel quite as procedural there. So that's looking cool. And then what I'd finally like to do is also run this through a directional warp node. And this is going to allow us to use the height map to kind of give some directionality to this random noise. So if we take a look, it's just going to be kind of wavy because we don't have an intensity. But if I add a reroute image node here, we're just going to use the height map that we've plugged in to this. Let's just plug this into the intensity. And you'll see that it's going to start to take this noise now and shift it around the rocks and kind of stretch it and, you know, skew it, distort it basically, which is going to be really helpful for us. So now what we can do is drag this into a grayscale to color node. You'll see that it's going to bring this up here. But what's really nice about InstaMAT is that we can also just go and quickly drag and drop this in. And it's going to give us that grayscale to color conversion node just automatically. So we don't need to add one if we don't want to. And there's really no settings I want to change. So it's very quick to just drag and drop, and it will create this for us here. Now, I honestly don't really know how to expand this to create it like a big node. I don't know if this is like a special type of node that InstaMAT does if we just quickly drag it in versus searching for it. So if you want this node to look like the rest of the nodes, maybe just go and just search for it in the library instead of dragging and dropping. But now that we have that all blended together, what I'd like to do with our blend node is I'm going to drop the opacity down to something like 50%. And I'm going to change the blending mode from default to average. So we're getting just a little bit of that kind of noise showing up here, but it's not too intense. We just want to start slowly layering up these colors. Now I'm going to come back and just change some of the parameters for my clouds. So like for the clouds, what I'll do is maybe drop this down to something like 7. And I'm also going to change the directional warp directions from 2 to 4. So now it's going in 4 directions. It's going to be a little more omnidirectional there. And I also want to change the mode from average to minimum. So we're going to get, actually, if I just go back, reset this, you can see average is a little bit brighter overall. And minimum is going to allow us to kind of break out and contrast some areas so that we're not just getting a total noise distortion. Now, next up on our list of things to do is I'd like to start colorizing the various layers of the rocks that we could created. And that's why I went ahead and used those blend height nodes, because it's allowed us to effectively just mask off the different layers here. As well too, if you find that your 3D view is a little bit tough to kind of see the colors and everything that's going on, don't be afraid to go and switch out the HDRI you're using. You might find that it's easier to maybe visualize some of the colors with a different environment map. I'm going to go and add a blend over here, making sure I'm going to put that in the background here. Again, just pressing Control. And one more time, I'm going to just add another blend. Again, Control and put that there. So I'm going to do 2 separate layers with their own kind of very subtle fill color. And I'm also going to change the blend mode from default all the way down to color. So we're really just kind of using the hue from whatever node we plug in the foreground, and then we're going to create masks for both of these. So I'm going to look for a solid color node, plug this in, and for this one, I'm just going to quickly drag and dropper the color I have on my second monitor here, which is going to be a bit of an orange color. And let's just drag this over to the second one. Again, selecting a color on my second monitor, and it's going to be just kind of a red color. So it's not going to look great right now, but once we start creating the masks for these, it's going to really add just a little more complexity to it. So make sure to follow along pretty closely to what I'm about to do here, because this is where it can kind of get a little confusing. And if you find that the blending isn't working with some of the masks that we're creating here, you might want to just kind of repeat this little chapter here, just because order is kind of important in how we're setting this up. So if I come on back to our kind of 3 major height blends here, right? This is where we go ahead and add some of these mid rocks, some of the smaller rocks, and then some of the pebbles. So with each of these, right, it's created a new mask. But the problem is, even though we're blending together these like different height maps and it's creating masks for it, some of these pebbles may be on top of some of these rocks. And some of these rocks may be on top or intersecting with some of these rocks. And so the problem is that this mask here for this layer may not be the most accurate mask to kind of mask those out. And what I mean by that is I'll kind of show you. If I bring just this mask up and over, and I'll just go and hide that for now. You'll be able to see that it's kind of masking out a lot of these medium rocks, but it's also masking out some of those smaller pebbles as well. And you can even see here, right? It's creating a mask in an area that there doesn't really seem to be a lot of height information to. So since we've created this mask and then started to blend in other rocks later, this isn't the most up-to-date version of the mask that we could use. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to hide that one, and let's visualize the orange one here. We have to do this in kind of a series of steps. So this mask, let's add a blend, and I want to put this in the background. So make sure that this first blend goes into the background, and this second blend goes into the foreground. So what I want to do is I want to go ahead and subtract this. So we're only going to be getting this mask subtracted by this mask, which is going to generate something like this. And actually what I'll do here is I'm going to press Alt just to create this little temporary connection there. Let's go ahead and add another blend node. Again, making sure this is in the background. And let's take this mask and plug it into the foreground. And again, we're going to subtract. So now all we're getting is effectively, let's take a look here. This rock layer, the mask for this rock layer, with the added calculations of the blending that we've done in these next two blend height nodes in our kind of like chain here. So now if I go and plug this in, I'll plug this one into the orange. This should be the most up-to-date version of this mask. And you can see, right, even some of the other rocks that we've blended in after aren't going to be affected in this. So they're just going to remain that base color that we had generated here. So that's really cool. What I'd like to do now is I'm going to just Alt and take this mask out. We can get rid of that connection. I'm going to plug this second last blend height into our background, and I'll plug this one into here. So now we're going to get the most up-to-date version of the mask for, if we take a look, this layer here. So let's go and drag this into our one over here. And if I go and unhide this, now you'll see that we're getting all those rocks turning up red, but again, they're not turning those pebbles a different color here. And even still, if we want to go ahead, maybe add a blend node, again, making sure it's in the background. Let's go and do a new color as well. And let's say something like, I don't know, I'll just do blue for right now. Because this is the final mask in this series of masks essentially that we're creating, we don't have to worry about subtracting this anywhere. So we should just be able to plug that in, and now all of our little pebbles are going to get that color there. Sweet, so that's been a very quick but hopefully concise way of showcasing how we can separate these layers and why I use that blend height. So now let's take a look at actually bringing these back to be a little bit more subtle color changes. So for our first one, I'm going to just set this to around like 3% maybe. In our second blend here, we can maybe set this to something like 5. And then for the blue, if we take a look, I don't know, we can do something like maybe 5 might be too much. Let's try 3. So in our 3D view, you can kind of see some color variation. It's not crazy, but we want to kind of keep it subtle, right? We don't want to be too extreme. And if we go back and just kind of compare our before, which is very grayscale in its color and its hue, to after, I might actually even just decrease that red there to something like 3. I think it's a little too intense. So that's how we can introduce some color variation between those layers, but feel free to go ahead, play around with it, and try different masking options to see what kind of cool combinations you can get. Next up on our things to do with this, I'd like to go and add a bit of a moss kind of texture layer on some of the tops of the rocks. And I just want to mask it off to those certain regions kind of at the tip tops of the rocks. So let's add a blend node. Again, bringing it into the background. And I'm going to just steal this color here and plug it in. And I'm going to quickly, again, just grab a color off screen, which is going to be this kind of mossy lichen kind of green color here. And now we need to create that mask for these kind of lichen areas. So what I'm going to do is take our final height here. Let's look for a histogram select. And what this will do is kind of along that grayscale gradient from top to bottom, I can go and select a specific portion of that height. So if I go and drag this into our mask, you'll see that with this, I can go and select very specific regions of the rocks. Now, I want it to just be kind of the tops of the rocks. So I'm going to put it to a value of 1, which is going to be the brightest values in our rocks here. But it's not really looking super convincing as moss quite yet. So what I'd like to do is take our mask here and also blend it with some type of just procedural moisture noise. So I'm going to search for moisture, and I think the one I was using in my testing was this moisture splash. It kind of has this cool kind of like moldy look to it. So with that, I can go and blend these together. And I'm just going to set the blending mode to be multiply. That way, we're using whatever kind of like values we have here as a mask to then show whatever values we have here. So wherever both of these images are white or at their brightest value, there's going to be something kind of showing up here. So effectively, we're gating it off to only the top regions of these rocks. Now I'm going to switch the blend mode here to be add, and I'm going to drop it down to maybe like 20%. So it's going to be not as green. It's going to still be kind of like a whitish green. And now we can also increase the range, maybe something like 0.55. And I'm not even sure if we play with this factor. Maybe I'll do something like 0.9. Just so we're getting some of that kind of like moss look you can see on some of these rocks here, which looks really kind of neat, as if it's kind of growing and living on the surfaces of these rocks. And once we're satisfied with our moss, let's keep going and add just a little more kind of noise and subtle variation to everything. So I'm going to add if I can hit this line here, blend. Don't take that out of context. Now I realize what I've just said. So let's go and take this into the background. And we're going to add another solid color. Man, the amount of double entendres I have probably said in my lifetime on this channel is just insane. So I'm sure you could probably go back and clip a number of stupid things I've said. Anyways, let's keep going. So bringing this into the foreground, and I want to, what color do I want to make this? And I'm going to just quickly go and steal my color off screen, which is going to be this kind of like mid kind of gray. And just to add some more variation in the color to this, what I'm going to do is use a spots 3 node. You can see it's just a bunch of random kind of procedural noise. And this is going to be driving our mask. So if we take a look, it's going to be kind of cloudy. So for the scale of this spots 3, let's go and crank this up, make it a little more detailed. I'm also going to change the variance to 1. So we're going to get kind of like this Perlin fractal kind of design going on here. And then for our blend between these, let's go and change the blending mode to be linear dodge. So it's going to be kind of bright, but we're going to drastically reduce the opacity of this to something like 35%. And actually, I still even feel like that's maybe too much. Let's do 20. Yeah, we can do something like that. I think that's going to work. So we're just getting some kind of dusting going on. And again, our 3D view is maybe not the best place to quite look at the color just yet, because we also need to have a lot of this color affect the roughness, but we're going to get to that point. Don't worry about that. So now that we've added just that last bit of kind of like color variation, what I generally like to do, and actually I'll bring all of these back just a bit, is I want to go ahead and use some features of these rocks, like the curvature of them, to start defining some edges and stuff along the surface of these rocks. So I'm going to bring our normal map back, and I'm going to look for a normal to curvature node. So this will allow us to find some of those features of both the peaks and the valleys, or the convex and concave aspects of these rocks. And if we go and add another blend node, plugging this into the background, and again, just dragging out a solid color node, I'm going to go and just quickly eyedropper this. And it's going to be kind of like a slightly brighter, pretty much totally grayscale value. And the blending mode that I would like to use for this is going to be overlay. And the reason I use overlay is it kind of maintains, if we take a look between our kind of input here and the output, it maintains a lot of the color value and the hue, and it really just plays around with the value of the underlying color. So that's why I like to use the overlay blending mode. Now we could go and just plug this in, with whatever kind of output mask we have here. It does have outputs for both of those. But what I want to do is just drag this out and actually use a curvature to mask. So now we have a little bit more control over a lot of the parameters of this mask that we're creating. And with this is what we're going to actually create our masks with. So this first mask is going to be our convex, or our edges. I'm going to drag the medium opacity up all the way. You can play around with some of these values as well. It might be a little bit tough to get anything because we might have to come back and just change the radius of this. Maybe something like 0.07 makes it a little bit sharper. So now we can see, yeah, we're getting a bit of a kind of sharper mask here. Actually, if I drop this, let's drop both of these down to 0 and see what we can get. Yeah, so the sharp opacity is not going to be too much. The fine opacity, again, not a whole lot. So what I'll do is I'm going to just kind of leave the large at 50, and I'm going to bring the medium opacity up to 100. So we're getting something pretty crazy like that. So you can see we're getting some of those edge highlights, just kind of like wear and tear on some of these rocks. And now we're going to do pretty much the same exact process here, but we're going to do the concave areas, or kind of like the cavities of where maybe dirt would start to collect with this. So I'm going to just Alt click this, drag this in, and we'll bring out just another solid color. Bring that in. And instead of default, we're going to go down to, again, overlay. And this time what I want to do, let me just mess around with some of these parameters. Actually, let's go into cavities. And then I'm going to bring this value to be something just a little bit darker. So a value of 0.5 is kind of mid-range, and it won't do anything with the overlay blending mode. But if you go below or above, that's when you start to add some of those cavity colors or those edge colors. So I keep it kind of generally around 0.5. You can see a value of 0.47 is kind of where I landed. So if we take a look at our mask, right, we can see that we're getting some of those kind of concave areas that collect dirt around the perimeter of some of these rocks. And what I'm going to do is, let's drag this down. I'm going to bring this back to, not 0.5, 50%. And let's bring the fine opacity up. So it's going to be just kind of sharp. And actually, what does the large opacity? Well, maybe I'll bring some of this back in to something like 50%. So we can see what we had before and what we had after. Now, if you want these to be a little bit darker, go and just drag the value of this down. You can see that it starts to almost make it look cartoony. I generally tend to keep this around a value of 0.5. And actually, maybe we can even do like 0.45. Yeah, see, even that starts to be a little too dark for more realistic values. So I'll do 0.47. But now we're starting to get some definition into these rocks. And we can see that, some even that layering of the colors is starting to look really cool. We might want to go back and fine tune some of this. Like maybe these are looking just a little too blue. So maybe I'll do 1.5%. Or we can even start to play around with the colors, maybe bring them to be a little bit more green. Bring the saturation back, something like that. But we have a pretty flexible system now to just really start tweaking this, even though we're not quite done yet. We're now at a point where I start to kind of consolidate my material. Right now, right, we've been kind of just overlaying a couple of these different textures and isolating some of the layers of the rocks. But now I want to start to tie them all together with kind of the environmental effects that would affect all of these rocks kind of together. And that's going to be some dirt. Now, there's two types of built-in masks that I used for this, which were really handy. The first one is going to be, if I start to type in material mask, dirt and dust. So we're going to use both of these. And if we just take a look at the base parameters, you'll see that dirt is going to be a bit of a grungier looking effect, whereas dust is going to be a nice kind of soft dusting type of pattern. Now we need to plug in a couple like required maps here. You can see that we need the height in the AO and then the normal for this one as well. So go ahead and plug those in real quick. And now we should get something like this. So for our dirt, right, it's kind of masking off some of the rocks just a little bit. And for the dust, it's pretty much masking off all the rocks, right? The dust is kind of just landing kind of in between those crevices there. So what I'd like to do is let's go and blend these together. So it doesn't really matter what order we put them in, because the blending mode of screen is going to only take kind of the bright values. And you see that we've now created kind of this dusty, dirty mask here. So let's add another blend node onto our color chain. Again, putting this in the background. And then let's use this as our mask. And just taking a quick little glance at this, you can see what the effect is going to do is it's going to fill in some of those areas, kind of unify these as if they're in a very kind of rugged, dirty environment. So I think this is already starting to work out pretty good. Now we can go and add a solid color yet again. Plug this guy in. And I'm going to use our eyedropper tool one last time to grab this kind of like dirty brown color. And we can see that's starting to really kind of tie in some of those elemental features. Now it's still looking very shiny. Well, we'll figure that out in a minute here, but we have the groundwork already laid out for us with this mask here. So it's going to be very easy to make this a lot rougher. Now go ahead and play around with some of the parameters for these as well, right? I'm not going to showcase too much of these because you can really fine tune it to be however you want. But as long as you have the proper inputs for the maps that we're generating, like our normal and our height and our AO. These are going to be very flexible masks to create very complex types of masks for this dirt. And once you're satisfied with that, let's just close out our color by using a sharpen node. And this is just going to help us, if we plug this in, just kind of sharpen some of this detail. Now, by default, it's a little too intense. You can see that it's kind of crazy how intense it is actually. So let's change the strength down from 50% to maybe something like 10. And if we just look at a bit of a comparison, right, it's a little blurry. This is just going to help sharpen everything up. And that's starting to look pretty cool. Well, starting to look pretty cool. I hope it looks pretty cool because we've reached the end of the base color. So hopefully you have something like this that you're satisfied with. And next up on our list is closing out our material by just tweaking the roughness to make sure it reflects the color that we've now created. All right, so let's close this material out. We're so close to the finish line. And the way to do that is the roughness map. Now, there's a million ways that you could go about starting your roughness. And for this particular material, the way that I went about doing it is actually by coming up to our initial color area where we created this directional warp. And I went ahead and used this here, just because this is kind of the first level of variation in our color map. And so we're going to be able to derive some roughness values, I think, from kind of this noise here. So I'm going to make sure I select the grayscale output. Don't go and select the color because I'm going to bring this through a levels node. And now let's just bring this down kind of in between our normal and our ambient occlusion here. So I'd like to see this on my 3D model. So I'm going to bring this out and start to type in roughness. Again, it's case and spelling sensitive. Well, actually, I don't know if it's case sensitive, but probably best bet is to just make sure it's case sensitive as you're typing it out. And let's go and expose roughness as a graph. And when we do that, we should hopefully see that it's gone and updated our 3D view here. So I can bring this just out and over. Doesn't really matter where. And for this, what I'm going to do is just kind of muddy it up again. So let's go and use another fractal warp so that we're getting something kind of noisy like that. And then I'm going to use a brightness and contrast node to just change kind of the overall contrast, make it a little more contrasted. And I'm also going to bring our brightness up to like 0.35. So it's got more contrasted areas between rougher and smoother. Right now it still looks pretty glossy, but that's okay. We're going to fix that here in a second. But I do want some kind of stark variation between these two. And I might even bring this up to something like 0.85. So that's not a bad start. What I'm also going to do is use some of the curvature of these to define some of that roughness, right? Because some areas that are maybe like cavities or edges might be worn or have dirt, and they might not be as smooth or glossy as some of the other kind of smoother surfaces or rounded surfaces of these rocks. So I'm going to use a to curvature, normal to curvature node here. And I'm going to just use the output of this to run through a levels node. And what I'm going to do is actually just invert. If I go and select this up top here, invert our outputs so that it's going to be kind of brighter just overall. And I'm also just going to crank this up too. So what we're getting is some of the surface of the rocks here are going to be a little bit smoother because they're darker, and some of the cavities are going to be a little bit rougher. So now what we can do, let's go and just blend these together. And I'm just going to get this kind of socket out of the way here. It's a little distracting. And I want to make sure that I plug in our curvature line here into the background. So now what I can do is go and use the add mode so that we're getting some rough kind of rocks with a little bit of glossier surfaces kind of peeking through, right? And that's going to look a lot better for these rocks here. You can use the shift and right click to rotate your HDRI around to see what it would look like. And already I think that's looking significantly better, but we're not done there yet. Because next up, we're going to also bring in some of our dirt from that dirt mask we created, right? Dirt is a very rough surface most of the time, obviously, unless it's wet. But in this instance, we're just going to have it as kind of being a bit of a drier kind of dirt to fill in some of those cracks. So let's go and add another blend node onto here. Again, putting this in the background. I really wish it would, just a bit of a pet peeve of mine. I wish when we create blend modes, it would put it in the background, not the foreground, because generally we're blending things on top, not under. I don't know. Just a bit of a workflow change up for me. If you've ever used Designer, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's definitely one of the pain points moving into InstaMAT. But regardless, InstaMAT is still very powerful and a really cool software. But if there's any developers watching this video, I would love it if we could just change the default behavior to put this in the background. Anyways, let's go and drag our mask here, plug that in. And I want to make sure that we're now using the screen blend mode, right? We want to keep the white values, but get rid of those darker values. So that it's going to, if we just kind of take a look, quick comparison, right? Without the dirt, with some of the dirt. Now what we can actually do is if I come back, play around with our levels. If I drag this output slider down a little bit, this is what's going to allow us to make it a little bit rougher. If I go and just change the orientation here of our lights, right, you can see that it's bringing back some moisture into these rocks. So this is how you can go and add some of those glossier kind of areas to it. So playing around, tweaking these levels here. And then again, our dirt is going to just make sure that those areas are not super smooth. I might just go and decrease the intensity to like 80%, something that's not as harsh or as, rough. And then finally, like we did for the color, let's go and just quickly sharpen this up. Again, that's pretty intense. It's a little tougher to see than color is, but that might cause some weird kind of like contrasted artifacts for our roughness. So I'm just going to bring that back to 10, right? Here's what we had previous, and here's what we have now. Well, thank you for checking out this video. That's going to conclude our time here in InstaMAT until the next video, whenever that is and whatever that is. I want to thank you for sticking through with this video. I know it's going to be long. I haven't edited it yet, but it's going to be quite a long video, I'm sure. And I would encourage you to keep going with this material, especially if you're new to InstaMAT or creating materials. Check out my previous video where I cover really the whole spectrum of what InstaMAT has to offer for creating materials. We cover parameters and local variables and stuff like that. We go a little bit more in depth as to what you can do and how you can really accessorize and customize materials and bring some of that knowledge here into this material as well and figure out how you can go and create some of these outputs and even tweak some of these settings to make this graph reusable instead of just like a one-time thing that you were following here on YouTube and really make it your own. So thanks again for watching, guys, and I'll catch you in the next video.